أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن سيدنا محمدًا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم لك الحمد حمدًا دائمًا مع دوامك ولك الحمد حمدًا خالدًا مع خلودك ولك الحمد حمدًا لا يريد قائله إلا رضاك ولك الحمد بالقرآن ولك الحمد بما هديتنا ولك الحمد بما سترتنا يا ربنا لك الحمد كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك وعظيم سلطانك ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن نهج منهجهم إلى يوم الدين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
The Amir Sahib, Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat Nigeria, royal fathers here present, religious leaders here present, distinguished invited guests, brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. The topic of today's discourse is just and equitable relationship between nations as a panacea to global insecurity. Just and equitable relationship between nations as a panacea to global insecurity. It was Ali bin Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu that said, Al-adala was-salama taw'aman. Justice and equitability. Justice, equitable relationship, was-salama and peace, taw'aman, are twin concepts. You exclude one, you don't get the other. It is not just a prerequisite for peace in nations, in every human community. In fact, in the basic unit of social organization, the family, you still need justice and equitable relationship, or just an equitable relationship if you want peace. So at the global level, it is very important. I want to start by quoting from a book by John Perkins. It is very, very instructive. In the preface to his award-winning book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, published in 2004, John Perkins writes, economic hitmen, EHMs, are highly paid professionals who cheat countries around the globe out of trillions of dollars. They funnel money from the World Bank, the US Agency for International Development, USAID, and other foreign aid organizations into the coffers of huge corporations and the pockets of a few wealthy families who control the planet's resources. Their tools include fraudulent financial reports, rigged elections, payoffs, extortion, sex, and murder. They play a game as old as empire, but one that has taken on new and terrifying dimensions in this time of globalization. I should know. Why? Because I was an EHM, an economic hitman. This frightening narrative does not end here. John Perkins continues. I wrote that in 1982 as the beginning of a book with a working title, Conscience of an Economic Hitman. The book was dedicated to the presidents of two countries, men who had been my clients, whom I respected and thought of as kindred spirits. Jaime Roldos, President of Ecuador, and Umar Torrijos, President of Panama. Both had just died in fiery crashes. Their deaths were not accidental. They were assassinated because they opposed that fraternity of corporate, government, and banking heads whose goal is global empire. We EHMs failed to bring Roldos and Torrijos around, and the other type of hitmen, the CIA, sanctioned jackals, who were always right behind us, stepped in. I was persuaded to stop writing that book. I started it 4 more times during the next 20 years. On each occasion, my decision to begin again was influenced by current world events: the US invasion of Panama in 1989, the first Gulf War, the Somalia War, the rise of Osama bin Laden, and etc. However, threats or bribes always convinced me to stop. This story must be told because only by understanding our past mistakes will we be able to take advantage of future opportunities. Because 9/11 happened, and so did the Second War in Iraq. Because in addition to the 3,000 people who died on September 11, 2001 at the hands of terrorists, another 24,000 people died from hunger and related causes. In fact, 24,000 people die every single day because they are unable to attain life-sustaining food. Most important, this story must be told because today, for the first time in history, one nation has the ability, the money, and the power to change all this. It is the nation where I was born and the one I served as an EHM, the United States of America. What finally convinced me to ignore the threats and bribes? The short answer is that my only child, Jessica, graduated from college and went out into the world on her own. When I recently told her that I was considering publishing this book and shared my fears with her, she said, "Don't worry, Dad. If they get you, I'll take over where you left off. We need to do this for the grandchildren I hope to give you someday." After this response, the fears, the threats, and the bribes no longer matter. The modern world, brothers and sisters in Islam, beloved brethren in faith, the modern world is today a cauldron where all kinds of suffering are brewed. It has, since the last quarter of the last century, gradually turned into a grand amphitheater on which stage the worst subhuman traits of men are acted out in the presence of a stupefied, confused, and traumatized audience. Like a trimly jigsawed, well-packaged spy suspense movie, the events in the world move at such a pace and in such an unpredictable manner that makes the wisest man gasp for breath. In the face of this abnormality, calls for peace at the global level seem to have become the obsession of world's global moral authorities, the religious leaders. In fact, the immediate past supreme head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat worldwide, Hadrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad Rahmatullah Alayhi, spent the most part of his illustrious life working for the enthronement of peace at the global level. Two of the most recent and momentous efforts towards the restoration of global peace are the historic addresses of the current supreme head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat, Hadrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad Hayyadahullah Ta'ala bin Nasr al-Aziz, at the heart of Western civilization in 2012. His Holiness was at Capitol Hill, Washington, D.C. on 27 June 2012 to address American congressmen, statesmen, media experts, academics, and public analysts on the topic, the path to peace, just relations between nations. Similarly, on the 3rd and 4th of December 2012, His Holiness delivered a keynote address on the topic, the key to peace, global unity, at the European Parliament in Brussels, in the presence of leading statesmen representing 30 countries. These efforts should be replicated everywhere people understand the importance of peace. It was the former Secretary General of the United Nations that said that never in the history of the world has the feeling of insecurity been as high as we experience it today. But it may be necessary to go to the root of the global phenomenon itself, nationhood. What is nationhood? Because we do not have a United Nations if there are no nations. And Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us, O mankind, we have created you from a male and female, and we have made you into tribes and sub-tribes, that you may recognize one another. Verily, the most honorable among you in the sight of Allah is He who is the most righteous among you. Surely Allah is all-knowing, all-aware. Quran chapter 49, verse 14. The Western concept of nationhood and national identity is a product of several centuries of strife, wars, conquest, enslavement, treaties, and violations of personal and institutional dignities. This sordid past left an indelible mark on the psyche of the Western man, as a result of which he has come to cherish individualism and freedom. These two concepts brought together and translated into political action have given birth to protection of one's territory, respect for human rights, and survival of the fittest. National identity, therefore, is not more than, to borrow the words of Leah Greenfield, a cultural construction, an historically contingent phenomenon, and thus, in a certain sense, an accident. Issues of nationhood and national identity are often major factors in much of the contemporary world's conflict. Every man claims to belong to one nation or another, and very often gives allegiance to it and glorifies it above others. He therefore sees his support for the nation and his derision of others as patriotism. National consciousness in most of the Western society is therefore seen as an exclusivist sentiment for the promotion of self-love and self-dignity. Islam, however, maintains that man must see himself as a member of a global family. His national or tribal affiliations are only for social identification and do not confer on him any status of superiority. One of the major challenges to peace in the world is racial and national arrogance. Despite the economic factors, the First and Second World Wars had their roots in the feelings of superiority by some nations of the world. When a nation looks down upon other nations, it falls into the abyss of totalitarianism and perpetrates atrocities against them and seeks legitimacy in its superiority complex. Such a nation thus becomes a victim of its own insensitivities, as its peace and security are continually threatened by the victims of its tyranny, as well as the absence of goodwill of its neighbors. Much of the unrest in the modern world today came into being as a result of the arrogance of the Western world. The United States of America in particular has a large share of the blame. The American psyche has not totally cast away the influence of the racist ideology it inherited from its founding fathers. Addressing the U.S. Senate in 1890, J.J. Ingalls declared, "The race to which we belong is the most arrogant and rapacious, the most exclusive and indomitable in history. It is the conquering and unconquerable race, through which alone man has taken possession of the physical and moral world. All other races have been its enemies or its victims." Similarly, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the American Declaration of Independence in 1776, and whose writings have had the greatest influence on several generations of American policymakers, declared, "I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only, that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowment of body and mind." A mindset such as this will no doubt breed hatred in the minds of the blacks and arrogance in the minds of the young Americans. This was what backfired during the American civil unrest in the 60s. In the reports of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, submitted to the US President in 1968, we have the following: "What white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. If there must be peace, nations must accept one another as equals. The United Nations must embrace this reality and back it with resolutions that have mandatory force. In this light, the inequalities associated with nuclear programs, arms development, and the exercise of veto power need to be addressed if truly the world wants peace. The developed nations must also be prepared to build bridges of benevolence by extending aids to underdeveloped nations with no strings attached. Writing in 1976, John Earth, in his book, The Nation State and the Crisis of World Politics, quotes Youthant as saying that the people of the world have perhaps 10 years left in which to subordinate their ancient quarrels and launch global partnership to curb the arms race, improve the human environment, diffuse population explosion, and supply the required momentum to world development efforts. 6 years ago, Professor Peggy Levitt, stunned the world of sociology and anthropology with her insightful study in her book, God Needs No Passport. She examines the reality of transnational living in most of the developed nations, and in the US in particular. She argues for the need to come to terms with the changes occasioned by immigration and insists that the political authorities, the native settlers, as well as the immigrants must all make a sense out of it. It is a well-known fact that men hardly migrate from comfort zones. Very few people leave their homes out of curiosity. If nations attach importance to the welfare of their citizens, and majority of the people live a life of fulfillment, the lure of migration reduces. The improvement in communication has opened up the secrets of the developed nations to eager explorers from the not so privileged nations. The natural instinct for survival is usually activated when people are oppressed in their homelands. If the developed nations truly desire peace, they must assist the underdeveloped clan of nations to grow rather than exploiting them. They must also educate their citizenry to tolerate immigrants who have settled among them, while immigrants too must integrate themselves into their new societies. Governments of nations must also embrace the reality of transnationalism in the 21st century. 15 centuries ago, Islam had foreseen the need for global citizenship through immigration and transnational living. Allah says in the Quran, "Verily, those whom the angels cause to die while they are wronging their own souls, they will say to them, 'What were you after?' They will reply, 'Kunna mustad'afina fil ard.' We were oppressed on earth. They will say, and the angels will reply, 'Alam takun ardullahi wasi'a fatuhajiru fiha.' Was not Allah's earth vast enough? Was the earth not large enough? Was it not vast enough for you to migrate therein?" Quran chapter 4 verse 98. This is a pointer to the fact that Islam recommends, in fact recognizes the need for transnational living, that you are not limited by your national boundaries. If you find yourself living in an environment where you cannot actualize your potentials, Allah says, "Alam takun ardullahi wasi'ah." It's my earth. This firmament I have created, this planet, is it not vast enough for you to migrate therein and seek the blessings of Allah? The above verse shows that Allah expects men to migrate in the land when they are oppressed, persecuted, or denied the opportunities of life. The question, was not Allah's earth vast enough for you to emigrate therein, closes the door of excuses against anybody who remains in a comfort zone and suffers thereby. Islam thus acknowledges the reality of a supranational, supercultural, and super-ethnic dimensions in the 21st century world. Just an equitable relationship, the only way out. Most of the crises the world has witnessed have been products of injustice and non-equitable relationship between nations. For example, virtually all the crises we've had in the Middle East, the Western media have referred to some people as the madmen of the Middle East. They talked of Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, they talked of Anwar Sadat of Egypt, they talk of Muammar Gaddafi, they talk of Saddam Hussein, they talk of Osama bin Laden, you talk of who else? Imam Khomeini. But the big question is, they have continued to destroy these people, yet more and more people are being reproduced. It shows that there is something wrong, something in the interpersonal relationship among nations, something reproducing these so-called tyrants. Because many a time we refer to them as tyrants in the media, and the people see them as heroes, except in very few situations. It is, for example, it was Woodrow Wilson of US, President Woodrow Wilson, that gave us the two principles of international relations: the right of peoples to self-determination and inadmissibility of the use of force in the acquisition of territory. Over the years, the US, in fact, Woodrow Wilson confessed to Winston Churchill in 1940 that if we are talking about the right of peoples to self-determination, we do not talk about the backward nations in Africa and Asia. So from the beginning, it was not diplomacy, it was duplicity. From the beginning, it was a hypocritical concept. It wasn't based on the principles of justice. And that is the reason why the Western world is suffering, is feeling the weight of its own injustice to all the nations. Justice and peace are two sides of a coin. The absence of one determines the absence of the other. Several of the crises that have challenged global security have their roots in the injustice done by some nations against other nations. The ugly episode of colonialism indeed left a bitter taste in the mouths of the people of colonized regions. It also taught them a lesson that with raw power, goals could be achieved. Thus, the foundation was laid for the birth of a different kind of tyrants, men mentally nurtured in the academy of Western imperialism, whose allegiance is neither to God nor to humanity. The conflicts of the modern world and its attendant feelings of insecurity are all offshoots of the philosophy of survival of the fittest, which drove the early Western imperialist schemes. The bitter truth is that it still does. The Western powers, despite the lip service they pay to the concept of justice, do not seem to know its meaning or are determined to turn a blind eye to it. Nothing threatens the peace of the world today other than the fruits of the seeds of injustice they have planted in different lands and climes. Apart from dismembering the Ottoman Empire and carving out Kuwait from the Kingdom of Iraq during the Sykes-Picot Treaty, May 9 to 16 of 1916, the trio of Britain, France, and US also created an international consortium to exploit the oil of Iraq and its environs at the Conference of Allied Powers at San Remo, held on April 24, 1920. It was during this conference that they jointly entrusted the mandate of Palestine to Great Britain. According to Ralph Coleman in his monograph, Iraq and Kuwait, a history suppressed. 95% of the shares were divided among three countries. 95% of the shares of Iraqi oil were divided among three countries. Britain, 47.5%, France, 23.5%, and the US, 23.75%. The consortium of San Remo became the Iraq Petroleum Company. Where on earth is justice? 95% of a nation's resources in foreign hands and 5% for the people. Can one expect peace where such injustice has been planted? Definitely no. The Hydra-headed Israeli-Palestinian crisis, which may soon enter its first century, has been the major excuse for many violent actors in the Middle East. The collective rejection of truth and justice and the adoption of duplicity in place of diplomacy by the world powers have further fanned the embers of crisis. Osama bin Laden, for instance, declared, for over a century, Muslims in Palestine have been slaughtered and assaulted and robbed of their honor and of their property. Their houses have been blasted, their crops destroyed. This is my message to the American people, to look for a serious government that looks out for their interests and does not attack other people's lands and other people's honor. And my word to American journalists is not to ask why we did what, but ask what their government has done that forced us to defend ourselves. So we tell the American people, and we tell the mothers of soldiers and American mothers in general, that if they value their lives and the lives of their children, to find a patriotic government that will look after their interests and not the interest of the Jews. I say to them that they have put themselves at the mercy of a disloyal government, and this is most evident in Clinton's administration. We believe that this administration represents Israel inside America. Take the sensitive ministries such as the offices of the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the CIA. You will find that the Jews have the upper hands in them. They make use of America to further their plans for the world. Bin Laden's declared mission is to avenge the defenseless Palestinians who have been victims of American and Israeli oppression for a long time. To support justice is to be an enemy of injustice, wherever it may be, and whoever may be involved. The injustice done to the Palestinian by the UN, its organs, as well as international media organizations, is not quantifiable. In the whole saga, the perpetrator of the crime has been extolled, while the victim has always been castigated. However, this does not vindicate Osama bin Laden's position, because the 9/11 saga, which he was actually trying to defend, is not justifiable. He did not attack American soldiers. He did not attack people at arms, innocent citizens. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Arabs, non-Arabs, Americans, Asians were all there. Islam frowns at such a senseless and irresponsible action. And according to the Islamic jurisprudence, anybody guilty of such deserves to be punished. However, it does not rule out the fact that the US is the greatest terrorist in the world. Human history has documented the sorry state of how weak nations have been invaded by that very large nation because of sheer power. And US is not particularly better than other nations. You know, after the First World War, because American soldiers fought very far away from home, the World War did not devastate their own lands, but it devastated Europe. So while the European countries were busy rebuilding their nations, the Americans were able to move ahead. And that's the reason why they were able to attain the position of preeminence they attain today. Brothers and sisters in Islam, the teachings of Islam is very clear in this regard. Allah says, "O you who believe, be strict in the observance of justice and be witnesses for Allah, even though it be against yourselves and against parents and kindred." In fact, it may interest you to note that this particular verse of the Quran is written at the entrance of the Harvard Law School as the greatest declaration of justice and equitability in human history. This verse of the Quran, and they said Quran chapter 4, verse 135. "O you who believe, be strict in the observance of justice and be witnesses for Allah, even though it be against yourselves or against parents and kindred, whether he be rich or poor. Allah is more regardful of them both than you are. Therefore, follow not low desires, that you may be able to act equitably. And if you conceal the truth or evade it, then remember that Allah is well aware of what you do." The prejudice and stereotypes which characterize the media reports on Islam and the Arabs are also reflections of the injustice of the fourth estate of the realm, the media, to mankind's well-being. Some sections of the media have contributed to the negative reactions of some groups in the name of religion because of the unjust ways in which their activities are reported or analyzed. Similarly, innocent Muslims have been persecuted or branded for being Muslims simply because certain individuals have chosen to invoke Islam or its tenets in justifications for violent actions that in reality have nothing to do with Islam. Just as some Muslims have christened America the great Satan out of petty spite and misinformed enthusiasm, some media organizations have used such labels as Islamic terrorism or Islamic fundamentalism for reactions by groups whose objectives do not conform to the Islamic ideal. A typical example of that is what the Nigerian media has done and what they have continued to do. And what is that? The Boko Haram saga. Till this morning, you still see some mischievous writers in the papers, reporters in the media, using the Islamic sect, the Islamic fundamental sect. For God's sake, if we must use such labels, then it should be global. When ethnic issues are involved, when issues of social injustice are involved, and you prefer to use such religious label, then the crisis, the higher crisis in Northern Ireland should be seen as Christian terrorism. In fact, there have been so many issues of terrorism in human history perpetrated by religious groups, and they have not been called the names of their religions. Till this morning, Joseph Kony still terrorizes people in Uganda with his Lord's Resistance Army. Nobody refers to it as Christian terrorism. What we're saying in essence, it is not Islam or Christianity that has legitimized what these people are doing. So Islam does not in any way support what Boko Haram or any other person for that matter does, even if such a person seeks to justify his actions with what the Quran says. For example, Rajmohan Gandhi writes, it is true, Rajmohan Gandhi is not a Muslim, he's a Hindu. Right, it is true that the 9/11 attackers called themselves Muslims, and some of them may have conducted their attack in the name of Islam. Some of the killings in Rwanda in 1994 were conducted inside churches. All the killers and the victims too were Christians. Did that make the Rwandan killings a Christian crime? When Hindus and Buddhists are involved in terrible deeds in Sri Lanka, are we to blame Hinduism and Buddhism? Nazism and communism were enthroned, and the Holocaust carried out in supposedly Christian lands. Are we therefore to impute a great flaw to Christianity? Slavery was practiced and also apartheid in Christian societies, and often in the name of Christianity. Did the slaves blame Christianity? Were the spirituals anti-Christian? Did Nelson Mandela strive to alert his people in South Africa to an evil inherent in Christianity? In September 2003, I saw on TV the conversation that Brit Hume of Fox News had with President Bush in the White House. In the Oval Office, Hume asked the president about the sources of his inspiration. President Bush named Lincoln and pointed to the Lincoln portrait in the room. When Hume asked how Lincoln inspired him, the president said that in the time of Civil War, Lincoln fought for American unity. After 9/11, the president continued, he too felt called in the spirit of Lincoln to invoke unity in the United States. I think it is good to ask what Lincoln, if he were alive today, would have said. We can never know for certain, of course. Yes, it is perhaps useful to try. All know the timeless lines from the second inaugural, referring to the two sides in the war. Lincoln said, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us not judge, that we be not judged. Brothers and sisters in Islam, what we experience today, Nigeria itself seems to be at the brink of disintegration, total disintegration. Why? Because there is no justice and equitability in the Nigerian polity. Governments and corporate organizations do not seem to understand what governance truly means. We have beautiful names we give to so many unjust concepts. In the name of rule of law, we commit a lot of atrocities. If we must have peace, even at this level, at the national level, there must be just relationship between states, between the federal structures, the state structures, the local government structures, and between individuals within the society. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, so they say. I still remember very well that one of the finest declaration of objective was the national anthem we used to recite in those days. Only Allah knows the reason why it was changed. You still remember it. Nigeria, we hail thee, our own dear native land. Though tribe and tongue may differ, in brotherhood we stand. Nigerians all are proud to serve our sovereign motherland. Our flag shall be a symbol that truth and justice reign. In peace and battle honored, and this we count as gain. And so to hand unto our children a banner without stain. O God of all creation, grant these our one request. Help us to build a nation where no man is oppressed. And so with peace and plenty, Nigeria may be blessed. Look at that. It was such a beautiful, such a beautiful declaration of objective. But what do you, how many years? Less than 5 years after it was composed, we have started violating its concepts. Probably we felt it was too lofty. Those concepts were too lofty, and we decided, well, it's better we replace it with something that is not so committing. If we want peace, if we want to be free from insecurity, we must establish just and equitable relationships. Finally, from the above, it is obvious that unless strict standards of justice are maintained, the scourge of war and strife that plague the modern world will never be abated. Western powers should desist from practicing duplicity in the name of diplomacy. No nation, I repeat, no nation, however great and powerful, is superior to another. Indeed, history demonstrates that great empires had risen and fallen in its long trajectory. Where is Namrud? Where is Pharaoh? Where is Nebuchadnezzar and their empires? They have all gone into the dungeons of eternal perdition. Let us, as individuals, groups, and nations, reflect on this verse of the Quran, as contained in Quran chapter 49, verse 12, which was recited by Hafiz Saab at the beginning of this program. O ye who believe, let not one people deride another people. Haply, they may be better than they. Nor let a group of women deride other women. Haply, they may be better than them. And do not defame your people, nor call one another by nickname. It is indeed bad to fall back into the malpractice of the days of ignorance after having believed. And those who repent not, such are the wrongdoers. We beseech Allah by His mercy, which encompasses everything, by His grace, which surpasses everything, by His might, which overwhelms everything, by His attributes, which fill the foundation of everything, to continue to guide and guard every one of us. We pray that He touches our heart with His light, that we may continue to tread the path of peace and justice, so that we may be able to spread it into the world. May Almighty Allah use us as lights for the world. It was the Prophet ﷺ that said, we should always, Allahumma ja'alni nuran wa a'adhim li nuran. Oh Allah, make me a light and glorify my light for me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.